And I think we are live. Should we have a little should we have a little chat while we are waiting for people to possibly arrive before?
Sure, sure.
So for the people who are already here, we will be chatting about that Ludwig Wittgenstein, um, world famous philosopher who has been described as perhaps one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. He died in the 1950s. And crucially, as I am a linguistics themed VTuber, Wittgenstein thought about language. And that's what we'll be talking about today. Um, Fleur here knows about Wittgenstein. I know about language. And we will combine our information.
Bonjour, bonjour, bienvenue. I'm Flirdio. Welcome everyone. I'll be mostly covering like the Wittgenstein elements, and we've had a little bit of a chat. So as we can see, we've put up a little outline where we've combined our knowledge. So when everyone's here and ready, we can begin on to that.
So the question is, how do we know when everyone is here and ready? I think setting up a time for it might be quite practical. It is now 2 minutes past the hour, perhaps 5 minutes past, or something like that might be in order.
Hmm. Yeah, let's set 10:05 or whatever it is for you.
Yep.
Sounds good to me.
How do you usually do the intro part of collaborations? This is actually my first time collaborating, and to let you viewers in on a little secret, we had some technical issues. I think this is almost universal with collaborations like this. We managed to get online on the hour, but ideally we would have been more ready earlier than exactly when we promised.
I mean, things usually work out at the time they need to.
Yeah, and in any case, I've seen a number of collaborations or even solo acts start with minutes of a loading screen. That's actually something that I did myself at with some earlier videos that I started screaming with streaming with my pause screen for say 10 or 5 minutes, but I had the impression that some individuals had been tuning in and then having a look at the pause screen, waiting a couple of minutes, and then leaving. So I've taken to going online a couple of minutes before at most.
Yeah, that's probably a good technique. I just go on I just go online, whenever the hour comes on, and sort it out from there. At least one of my streams last week, it wasn't exactly my technical issue, but I was playing AI Dungeon, only for the site to crash in like the first few minutes of being online.
Ah, yeah, that could be a little bit of a technical issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, it's streaming is kind of an extension of conference presentations and things like that. So I'm coming in from a bit of a different view. In any case, I don't know if technically having this kind of lecture type content on Twitch is that functional. As I've noticed that viewers tend to arrive as the show goes on. So there's not a huge amount of people watching at the beginning. There are some who are waiting, and then the amount of viewers increases during the presentation. But if it works, it works. In any case, all of my shows are available on YouTube, so everyone who came in late or missed it entirely live can watch them at their leisure.
Yeah, once I hit affiliate, I'm going to start posting my VODs on a channel. And speaking of that, if you're just idling and my chat or Lloyd's chat mirror the other stream, just it very much helps for keeping up the viewer average.
Actually, speaking of, I am going to link your Twitch account on my Twitch chat so that the viewers will be able to check you out.
Thank you very much.
And I think that we are now past 5 past the hour. The hour is 7 p.m. for me, to dox myself a little. So if you're if
And I probably can't go past noon here, because Easter and stuff.
Yeah.
But so let's begin. So we start off this presentation with a little bit of a background on Wittgenstein's life circumstances. Uh, Wittgenstein came out of what my teacher called a meat grinder of a family, in that most of the children that came out of it, became doctors, lawyers, academics, etc. However, a bunch of them also committed suicide as well. It was that kind of intense pressure which formed Wittgenstein, and he was described by his peers as neurotic, thought himself to be mostly everyone's better, and didn't really want to talk to anyone who wasn't his equal, and was just absolutely hyper focused. And that kind of turned into they kind of gave him the ability to really obsessively look at language in a way that no other philosopher had prior. Wittgenstein instigated a event in philosophy known as the linguistic turn. With that, you need to kind of understand a bit about the history of philosophy, which is that philosophy has had different ages, so to speak. You kind of start with the Greeks, where it's very much focused on metaphysics. What exists. Even in the pre-Socratics, people like Zeno are arguing these grand claims about reality, saying that this exists and this doesn't exist, or this is an illusion. That's mirrored in Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, and that continues for a bit until we start to once you start to get more into later down the line, post Renaissance, you start to have the epistemological turn, which is asking, what do we know rather than what exists? Because there was a lot of problems that were brought up by that era of metaphysics, mostly being that they created questions they couldn't really answer, like the ship of Theseus, which is still, a fun. If you still go on YouTube, you'll still find people arguing about the ship of Theseus. It's all these metaphysical problems are uh, almost impossible to get around. So instead, they changed the direction of philosophy to epistemology, and you have Descartes and Locke and Hume and Bacon slowly pushing it, slowly going from like, okay, what do we actually know, to what we know comes through observation from the senses, and then to Bacon, where it's also about the methodology of it, what order you're putting your hypotheses in. But Wittgenstein kind of asks, how can we really continue with philosophy if we haven't solved the metaphysical issue? When we have the ship of Theseus, and at the time when they were having things like the teleport transportation paradox, where it's basically just the same variation on that one problem over and over again, there seems to be something uh, intrinsically broken in philosophy. And Wittgenstein said that was a bewitchment by the means of language, that he identified as the fallacy of reification.
Here we could have a bit of a tangent,
Yeah.
as I've gone a little bit into what reification is. This was a concept apparently invented in German, and the original word was Verdinglichung, so making into thing. And because intellectuals of the English language have traditionally had an immense respect, bordering on cringy respect, for the prestige languages of the Mediterranean, there was not any attempt to translate this to English. And instead, they translated it into English by translating it into Latin. So res, rei, the thing, and catificazione, facere, to make. So the process of making into a thing. In general, this is about treating a non-thing as a thing. So you treat an abstract concept as something concrete, or you treat something inanimate as as living. And if you are doing that, you are what a horrible word,
Reifying.
reifying. You are reifying the thing.
Yeah.
And then we get back to Wittgenstein and what he did not want us to reify.
Yeah. So Wittgenstein basically saw the main fallacy of reification as the broad acceptance of what he called vowels, which were statements with no evidence, but what that really means is no referent. And we like to think of language, as words mean something. Rock, it refers to a rock. Tree refers to a tree. But the majority of statements in the English language, even if they refer to a thing, don't really have don't really have a real reference. What is a bad mood? What's a good day? What's reputation? What's attention? All these things. Um, Lloyd's example was the concert was good. All these things don't really have a real referent, and it was the acceptance of these as fact, as real descriptions of the world, that Wittgenstein believed was leading language in the wrong direction. In the linguistic turn, he proposes that the direction of philosophy henceforth should be uh, a struggle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by the means of language. So he believed it was a pretty big deal.
This is also something that you have probably thought about in your everyday life and use of language. As for example, uh, being nondescript. Perhaps someone has described their favorite VTuber or movie or something to you in this very in a way that lacks any real content. So similar to this, the concert was good. My Oshi is cute. What does that even mean? Ideally, even in everyday life, you would like to explain and say things in a way that actually communicates what you want to say, and not just as a vague idea of what you might be thinking about. But of course, this also gets into a balancing act, because if you are too explicit about what you want to say, this might also have some social consequences, as a certain level of abstraction is usually desired socially. So you don't want to be too detailed about something, but at the same time, you would like to have a concrete content for what you are saying. A bit of a balancing act.
Yeah, and that kind of comes to what Wittgenstein called vowels and thus most of language, which was moves in a game. We think of language as trying to communicate and describe stuff, but in reality, what it's really doing is it's playing a game of meanings with acceptable moves, uh, to be able to order people around, to be able to tell people what they should think. if you phrase something like, say, stay away from me, that's a very direct ordered command. But if you say something like, I have a bad mood, again, that's a fundamentally meaningless statement. Like, of course, don't go around, dissing on people's emotions, but what exactly is a bad mood? Is it sadness? Is it anger? Is it being grumpy in the morning? All it's really saying is, oh, leave me alone for a bit. And so, what it is at the end of the day is this move in a language game.
And this gets us into the topic of trying to communicate with someone outside of our own cultural context, either a foreign individual or hypothetically an animal or an alien. And there are some ideas about what a universal language or a universal symbol could be. When it comes to universal language, I've heard some mathematicians claim that mathematics would be a universal language. This depends on what they actually mean when they say this, but the way that I understand the phrase, I have to disagree. And I am going to go right here into a little bit of a tangent. Here we have first an example of a sentence in mathematics, if we conceptualize mathematics as a language. If you have some, I think this should be at least at the bachelor level in mathematics or engineering or something to that effect, you will be able to recognize that here we are integrating um, in cylindrical coordinates. So we have height. One moment, I will draw. We have height, and we have a radius that increases, and then we have a full rotation at the end of it. So this ends up being the volume of a cylinder. But could you understand that if you had not received a specific kind of education and specifically within a Western intellectual environment? I don't think so. And for as an example of this, here further right, we have the same content written both in Latin and in mathematics. And if you listeners would like to engage in some audience participation, I would ask you to type a 0 in the chat if you do not understand either of these, a 1 if you understand the Latin, and 2 if you understand the mathematics, and perhaps a 3 if you understood both of these. In Latin we have campus magneticus nusquam apparet nusquam que evanescit. And in mathematics we have the divergence of B equals 0. Both of these mean that magnetic fields do not appear out of nowhere and do not disappear. So, to be more practical, this is why within a magnet you have the field lines coming in, going through the magnet, and then doing their little circles outside the magnet. But of course, this is another thing that you will absolutely not be able to understand, whether it is written in Latin or mathematics, if you do not have the education to understand these languages. Then our second main topic about this theme.
Before I move on to that, I think it actually is. I could mention a bit of history, which is that kind of Wittgenstein's equal throughout his life was his teacher Bertrand Russell. And if you know Bertrand Russell, throughout the majority of his life, he really loved math. He, saw it as the universal language, as something like mental objects, beyond human, in much the same way the Greeks did. Wittgenstein said, math is a language. You're playing these. Sure, it's a very structured and ordered one, where the moves are really specific and have only one right answer. But it's still fundamentally a language, and he kind of broke Bertrand Russell with that. By arguing that into him. And so Bertrand Russell basically at the end of his life was like, yeah, mathematics doesn't have the same doesn't have the same wonder it had for me because of Wittgenstein. That's a funny little tidbit.
How unfortunate. And it seems that I have accidentally agreed with Wittgenstein. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not. I'm only superficially familiar with his work. So this was not me explaining his thoughts. This was me explaining my thoughts, which happen to be the same.
Well, you did a pretty good job because I somehow got a 5 on my calculus test, yet I was blanking through the whole time on this.
All right, then let's get into the universal symbols. There are some contexts when we would like to communicate with someone completely outside our own cultural context. In the modern world, it is incredibly difficult to find an intelligent animal that is not part of the Western sphere. You would have to go to the Sentinel Islands, for example, and try to communicate with them. And it would be extremely difficult, not only because of the language and philosophical barrier, but because they are extremely violent and don't want any foreigners on their island. Because a previous visitor performed some rather bizarre pseudosexual experiments on them, and they did not enjoy that. But outside of isolated humans, we might want to communicate with aliens, and for this I have an image of the Voyager Golden Plate, or we might want to communicate with humans of the far future, for which we have this painting of a nightmare hellscape. In the case of the Voyager plate, the idea is that this golden plate was actually launched into space with the hope that the inscriptions could communicate uh, facts about the human species to any alien that might find the plate. Whether it actually could is the question. There are various views on this. Perhaps Fleur has more information about these. And the other example is this hostile architecture. So the idea is that perhaps in the future Western society will collapse, but nuclear waste will still exist far into the future. And perhaps we would like it if the primitive humans of the far future after societal collapse would not play around with nuclear waste because it would be bad for their health. The question is, how do we communicate this? One of these ideas is this hostile architecture. So we would build a nightmare hellscape to try to communicate that this place is dangerous and that you should not come here and that there is nothing valuable here.
Yeah, let's discuss the Voyager plate and then get into hostile architecture
All
and
right.
ideas on it. Yeah, so the Voyager plate has a number of symbols that are meant to be universal. Like, for example, you have the orbiting satellite in the top left corner, some electromagnetic waves in the top right corner, uh, and then just various kind of diagrams. I believe the one right under the waves is a spectrometer, background radiation, and the one in the bottom left is is a is a is a particle collision or something of that nature to show that we are a scientifically advanced species. And the theory is that if you had similar measuring techniques as us, these would all read as meaningful, important symbols. But even then, like for example, with the electromagnetic waves, if you had a species that had some innate knowledge of electromagnetic waves, like in the same way that fish, geolocating do, they probably never developed devices that would read it out in just pure waveform. It would be something unnecessary to them. In the same way, we probably wouldn't be building a device, to translate our sight into some kind of wave either. Uh, so that might be lost on them. And and the same can go for the other ones, background radiation. The particle collision, of course, it's the flashiest one, but it's also the one that most normal people are going to be like, oh, that's flashy, nothing more to it. It really could be a collision of anything, or it could just be a general explosion. So there is a lot of ambiguity in these symbols. Do you have anything to say about it, Lloyd?
Nothing particularly insightful. The problem is that you would have to, even if the aliens manage to catch on to this idea that, for example, the ratios of these measurements are what we are trying to communicate to them, they have to they have to catch the thread first. Perhaps if they catch it, they would be able to pull on it and begin unraveling this structure. But in the case of actual human languages, in every case that dead and disappeared language which was written was successfully deciphered, there was some sort of touchstone, such as the Rosetta Stone between Greek and Egyptian written with Greek letters and Egyptian written with hieroglyphics. And in the case of Sumerian, there was a stone with Akkadian and Sumerian. In all of these cases, one of these languages was already known to us. And in the case of the aliens, they would have absolutely nothing to go by. Perhaps they could somehow brute force this. If they are spacefaring aliens, perhaps they have such computing capabilities that they could throw this thing in and just have it dry everything out. But that's just a guess. In my view, we don't really have any.
It would probably, even thinking about like our base assumptions, like drawing waves on the vertical scale from left to right, and instead of maybe in a more holistic approach, like to even think about alien writing, it could be far different in structure and composition of anything from human writing, and so they'd really have no touchstone. It would just be a computer brute forcing, like, okay, what's the right orientation, what's the why is it structured like this, and that assumes that computer could even brute force to understand those circumstances.
Exactly.
Could a
This is
human computer brute force alien language? Probably not.
probably not. And another question is whether it is physically possible for there to be unlimited computing power. In science fiction, it is, but is it in reality? I'm unfortunately not familiar enough with the physics of this kind of computing to give you any real answers. But let's say I remain a little skeptical about this. It might well be that,
Fair enough.
yeah,
I mean, we're already trying to make the jump into using particles as our on-off switches, and that's becoming the obsession of computing. So I don't actually really know how much further we can go.
yeah, my thought exactly. It might be that it will not be possible to brute force this kind of alien and abstract messages. Perhaps what we could count on is that the aliens would realize that this is a man-made structure, artificial, and from that they might be able to deduce that wherever it was sent from would be interesting.
Yeah, at least interesting. So it makes one point. It makes one point there. Uh, Now moving on to hostile architecture. This painting here was a proposed design for basically, universal things that tap into human sense of danger, human sense of oddness and unfamiliarity and ruined environments, to basically make sure that no one coming close to a nuclear waste dump site, if they saw all these, they'd be certainly discouraged. But as we had in our pre-stream discussion, Wood didn't really see that.
Yes, imagining even myself as a young man, a nightmare hellscape like this, isn't it exactly the kind of thing that you want to explore? Perhaps not in reality, as we do not see this in reality, but in any computer game that you see, if you see something like this, it's exciting. You want to know what it's about. And this is the exact opposite of the intended message that this idea has.
Yeah, actually, bringing up computer games is pretty funny because a lot of games have out of bounds areas. Where it'll give you some warning like turn back or whatever, like very explicit warning. And yet in those, I always am like, if I'll always be like, but maybe there's something hidden out there, and then I'll get sniped by their instant death wall or whatever.
An excellent example. And of course, explorers, real individuals in the past have died in droves to find something new, to find something possibly valuable. If the primitive humans of the future got into their heads that there's something valuable in here, and they started dying after they have went there, that might very well again have the entirely opposite effect. That there is some kind of power there that they want to find out, even if it's dangerous. Maybe they could use it for themselves, use it against their enemies.
Yeah, that is a good point. Anything, humanity is so adaptable that if you put up this thing and signpost it to people as inside this is a very dangerous thing, someone would find a way to weaponize it.
Um,
Uh,
I will draw a little. So, from my point of view, certain European countries have plans to for a final deposits of nuclear waste, quite simply by finding an extremely stable geological formation, digging practically a mine in there, and positioning the waste here at the bottom. This would be several hundred meters deep, and after that, just fill it in. Fill it with rocks, fill it with concrete. There isn't anti-nuclear activists like to say that there is some kind of a mechanism through which the nuclear waste could escape, but they have never explained one to me. My studies in nuclear physics were quite short. I was a physics student once, and I did learn one course in nuclear physics, which I imagine is one course more than the vast majority of people, but I'm not an expert. Nonetheless, even if water were to enter into this structure in the far future, it would have to go to the bottom and then get back out in order to bring some nuclear danger with it. A far more likely danger scenario would be someone trying to dig into here if they have been warned that this is a place that they should not be. If instead you just hide it, don't give them any indication that there's anything dangerous here, by the point where they will be able to dig hundreds of meters into solid rock, they probably have Geiger counters as well and will be able to understand what and why this place is dangerous.
yes, my design for if to add on to that, if you had some situation where the surface was poisoned, probably the best thing, in my opinion, to do would just be to salt the earth and make it completely barren and unusable land. There's, if you're a primitive, hunter gatherer, even agricultural civilization that is walking through and you're trying to find resources and you just come to this big salted field and it looks like everything is dead, but it's mostly that the soil is just bad. Uh, that's you're gonna be like, well, I mean, I can might be snooping around here for a bit, but I've got work to do. And when that comes around, you really I don't think you I don't I think people would learn, okay, it's not good for plants, it's not good for animals. If whatever is here, it's just useless, and it'll probably make things worse for me. Which then again, there's already a lot of mundane dangers that already do that kind of salting thing, like copper and stuff.
Hmm.
So it could easily blend in with those.
And there are even actually natural nuclear hazards. There is at least one deposit in Uganda, I think, that had a concentration of uranium ore that was strong enough to start its own spontaneous fission reaction back in the times of the dinosaurs. And of course, this was deep in the earth, much more powerful than the nuclear waste sites would be. And all the animals and all the people living in Uganda never found out about this. This was only found out with extremely modern technology. They didn't know. They didn't go looking for it. I think, I think we agree that that's a better way to go about it than relying on being able to communicate with someone whose mentality we fundamentally cannot understand.
Yep.
And I think this will be a good point to move towards point 4,
Mhm.
thinking through language. This is another topic to which we have a very large digression after listening to Fleur explain us Wittgenstein's ideas.
Yeah. So Wittgenstein, another of his big breakthroughs was that he argued fully that thought precedes language. You cannot have a thought without language, and you cannot, and there are no thoughts without language. And what he meant with by that is that, and also coming with that is that language fundamentally structures how you think. Uh, you when people hear this, they'll argue, what about mental images? What about impressions, sensations? A lot of that Wittgenstein covers later, but right now, just to cover mental images, okay, think of a red dress for me. Uh, to distinguish that dress from other dresses, you need to have red. And to distinguish that from other red things, you need to have a dress. And so, really, in the mind, when what mental images are is just language emulating an image. When we actually think about the properties of mental images, you realize it's not really actually an impression of the thing. It's not like, as we like to say, your brain took a snapshot of whatever you were seeing, listening to, hearing at the time, and that's preserved because when we think of mental images, it's mostly vague, formless things without boundary, without dimension. You know, look outside your window and take a mental snapshot of the city, and then tell me the relative sizing of most of those buildings outside your window. It's not going to happen because what you're really going to see is building. Oh, I know that place is a shop. Building, taller, smaller, whatever. But it's still going to be in terms of language, and that way, the brain is kind of one big image repository. It's like tagged image repository. If you've ever used a Dan Boru or anything like that.
And when it comes to color, color is something that has, let's say, an objective, truthful basis to it. When we see something as red, it is because it is reflecting certain wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation that are picked up in our eye. But many things have a basis in nature, but are still culturally constructed in our mind. Um, if I don't forget, we might go into a tangent of a tangent about other things like this. But I have looked up a table of the evolution of color distinctions in different languages. Many of you might be familiar with the Japanese language that does not strongly distinguish between what we would call blue and green. But this is not the only different way of conceptualizing colors. It appears that the most basic way of dividing colors is between bright and or warm and cold colors. So we know of some languages that group white, red, and yellow together as one major color group, and then black, green, and blue together as the opposite color group. And this breaks up in a very systematic way. We only know of languages where where the warm colors have broken up. So there are languages that have a concept for white, one for red to yellow, usually including brown as well, and then a third major concept that contains the cold colors. But at this point, we start breaking up. So different languages observable in the world have had the next step in breaking down languages in different ways. So, for example, here I think this is the 3Y type. So where you have white and red and yellow, and then the cold colors indistinct. Stereotypically, this would be expected in the tropics, where you want to differentiate between these kinds of colors just from what you need to survive. This starts getting into the kind of evolutionary psychology that is weakly founded in science, but we can say that this kind of color perception and the tropical environment correlate with each other. Why they correlate with each other is cannot be answered in a scientifically founded way. This is not the only way. We can, for example, also have the cold colors break up into a color that contains green and blue, but no longer black. Or we can have the black, the yellow, so the black split away as its main thing, and all the others. So you would have white, black, red, and all the other colors. And then going further, breaking these up, the middle one in the fourth column would be Japanese. Here we have green and blue, not strongly differentiated. Strongly differentiated here means that they are seen as a primary color. So, for example, my eyes are green. In Japanese, you might say midorime, so jade-colored eyes. This is not a strong differentiation. They would conceptualize jade color as a kind of aoi, so a kind of green-blue. In the same way that I might say that my eyes are emerald green, but emerald is not a color. I'm just comparing the color of my eyes to the color of something else that is also green. And in this typology, we eventually end up with far more color differentiation. We have seen new major colors appear even in the early modern period. For example, orange as a primary color is very new. If you went back, say, 500 years and showed an orange thing to an English speaker, they would most likely describe it as red. But they no longer do.
And magenta is another color that I think is given recent distinction as well. Because you still ask pretty anyone today, and they'll say either magenta is red or magenta is purple, kind of on a flip flop.
And here's I have an anecdote about a similar experience. And the Russian language has a major distinction between sini and голубой, which are usually described as blue and sky blue. My Russian is fairly weak, so I cannot exactly say where the border between sini and голубой stands. But on a Russian course, we had an exercise where we were supposed to ask each other, guess which color each other's houses were. And I did live in a house that was голубой at that point. And my partner kept going through the colors in her mind, asking, is it red? Is it blue? Is it green? Is it black? It was none of those. And she got increasingly confused, even though in our exercise book, we had a list of colors that included голубой. So this different conception of colors is something that we can entirely miss and not understand, even though we know about it. We have just been told about it. If we look at the list, Galuboy is there, but my partner was not able to think of Galuboy as a primary color.
Yeah, and it's the ability of the mind to make those distinctions through language, which can have a great effect on how we answer. The example that was given to me in class was a tribe in Uganda that has many distinctions between warm colors, but almost no distinctions between the cold colors, purple, blue, and green. And so they were given shades of purple, blue, and green, and asked, distinguish between these colors or say the most different color. And they would, and even though spectrum wise, the warm colors are much more related, they would say that those were much more distinct than the blue, green, and purple ones, even in ones with even shades of blue, green, and purple that were uh, when they had similar lighting, they would say that the shades were, almost indistinguishable or just a little bit, tinged one way or the other. So because they could not, formulate an easy differentiation between the colors, that's whiter, that's blacker than that. They dismissed it in their mind. They dismissed the difference. They said, "Oh, it's barely different at all."
Yeah. So, for example, I would imagine that if you showed them, for example, animals or rocks or things that were the same color as these color plates and asked them which is the same color as which, they would be able to match them to each other, but they conceptualize these cool colors as just a cool color. So this is, let's say this is the same color as andesite, but andesite is a kind of cool color. The same way as I'm sure many of you viewers have seen those joking images of color palettes where the man has just says red and the woman has 5 or 6 different subcategories of red. It's sort of like that. It's a kind of a hierarchy. So these primary colors are colors that are not part of another color. So green is not a kind of blue for us, but for speakers of other languages, they can be. And this is actually something that is an interesting topic in historical linguistics. I'll pull out an example from Old Norse because Old Norse had 2 colors or names for colors, blå and svarter. Blå is obviously a cognate of blue. Svarter is a cognate of swarthy, which means a dark person in modern English. Is also the same, is a cognate of schwarz or svart, so black in modern German or Scandinavian languages. But the differentiation of these 2 colors was somewhat different than the way we would do it now. For example, blue appears to have been more of a reflective color. So you have things that we would call black, but which are reflective, such as birds. Imagine a raven, for example. A raven might be called blue by an Old Norse speaker, and even humans, sub-Saharan Africans, were called blue men by the Old Norse, not black men, but blue men. Why this? Why exactly this distinction was made? I do not know. But the color perception, even for basic colors, is not as old as we might think. We can easily point to words like orange or magenta or something like that, that we know exactly when this distinction arose. But even the more natural appearing might not be quite as old as we think.
Yeah.
And with this, we have a bit of a problem because let's talk about the 4.1 feral children first, but remember that there is a further digression about this to the right.
Yeah, I saw that. I was interested in that, so I'll definitely want to get back to that.
So this was something that we wondered about in our preliminary chat, because Wittgenstein wrote that feral children are unworkable. And this is something that we have, as a society, since then found out to be true. Severely abused children who never learn a language stay in a state of mental disability through their entire life. They will be able to make sounds, they will be able to communicate with sounds, but it appears that some sort of level of abstract thinking is missing. So they stay on an almost animalistic level. And we wondered if this was already known in Wittgenstein's time, or did he intuit something that was later found to be true? In this case, not necessarily. I was able to find an article from 1959 which was talking about feral children and said that such children are not dumb but do not talk. Here, dumb is an old term for mute. So they make sounds but they do not communicate as we do.
Yeah. Um, as to talking about that, where that kind of falls in Wittgenstein's thought about thinking, is when we have when we have a when we have this child who's first learning a well, actually, we'll do this in learning the first language, so I'll hold on to that.
All right. Then let's
But
jump to.
the feral children itself, that as I was saying earlier with the mental images, when you don't really have and with colors, when you don't have the words to make associations and distinctions, thoughts are just kind of uncategorized. I think best to say it's almost instinctual behavior from them, because there's no metacognition, there's no putting it into language that's going to influence the thoughts. It's just senses trigger stimulus, stimulus triggers behavioral patterns, and there's not really a way to break out of that.
So let's jump to the right and a little bit high towards numeracy and incomplete language. I'll digress. My viewer picked the 20 comments. Now that's interesting. Thank you for the comment. Unfortunately, I was paying attention to the whiteboard, so I don't know which exactly was interesting. But getting to numeracy, in our not in our lifetimes, but in the lifetimes of people living now, a new language has emerged spontaneously, and this is the Nicaraguan Sign Language. This was spontaneously produced by the mute or deaf, most likely deaf, since the hearing but mute would learn Spanish. Population in Nicaragua, in some village or city. And it started from nothing and has since gained more grammatical complexity and richer lexicon, so vocabulary, in a few decades. And it has been studied the entire time. What is interesting here, apart from the comparison with Creole languages, which if someone listening is not familiar with, when you bring together people who do not speak a language and they have to communicate, they will produce a pidgin language, which is a very simplified, language for everyday needs. If you want, you can Google for BBC Pidgin. I will write it out here so you know how to spell it. Hopefully this is correct. If it is not correct, flip the D and G. The BBC produces news in West African Pidgin English. This will be quite interesting for you to read and listen to. These kind of languages are not grammatically complex, usually. But when children begin to learn these as their native language, because in the classical Creole case, we are talking about African slaves who were deliberately chosen from different ethnic groups so that they could not communicate with each other easily and therefore, of course, could not rebel. Eventually, the children do not learn any West African language. They start speaking the Pidgin English as their native language, and this develops into a feature-complete language. And this is basically the same process that has happened with the Nicaraguan Sign Language. That the first spontaneous language was very weak, but in the decades following, it has gained grammar and vocabulary and is a functionally complete language today. But we have individuals who grew up with various stages of development of this language, and there are quite interesting differences in their mathematical abilities. So, finally getting to the notes, I imagine everyone has already read them. All of the people studied in this article, that included Spanish speakers from the same community, young sign language speakers, adult sign language speakers, and old adult sign language speakers. So all of these were able to exchange money. So if you gave, for example, a $100 bill or 100 peso, centimo, they could give you the same amount in smaller denominations. And they could replicate amounts that they could see. So if you would put, say, 7 buttons on the table, they could pick out 7 buttons and replicate the amount. But with the older sign language speakers, so particularly the ones who had grown up with the extremely weak sign language, there it appears that they could not remember amounts. So for example, a full half of the oldest cohort could not actually count to 10, much less 100, which all of the younger signers and all of the Spanish speakers could do without any problems. So just count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It might take you a while to get to 100, and it would be annoying, but this is not a problem for anyone who has no mental disabilities and has grown up in a functional language environment. But it was a huge problem for the old adults who had grown up in a partially functional language environment. And again, the older individuals could not replicate ephemeral amounts. So for example, if I were to knock on my table, perhaps you heard that, you would have to replicate that. So you would have to count up how many knocks was that, and then knock back at me. They could not, even if these amounts were very, very small. We are not talking about 20 knocks here or anything. It's like 3 or 5. And this is very unexpected, in my view, that having weak language affects your memory of numbers or amounts. You might imagine that this kind of thing is not connected to language, but apparently it very much is.
That's very interesting.
And then let's not get into a huge tangent, but I mentioned that color distinctions are not the only thing that have a natural basis to them, but are cultural products. For example, being related, so family is another one. We can measure how closely individuals are biologically related, but that does not necessarily correlate with what they believe. For example, I think everyone listening has grown up in an ambilinear society. So we think that we are related to both our mother and our father equally. But there are also strongly patrilinear and matrilinear societies. So children are more strongly or only related to their father or mother. And in some of these societies, marrying, for example, your aunt can either be incest and illegal or perfectly fine, depending on if it's your father's sister or your mother's sister.
Yeah, that to me seems very cultural. In the same way that some societies, have idols or set spirits that will reincarnate at certain times into a family. So, for example, the great grandfather will reincarnate maybe into the new child or something along that nature.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah,
So things that we imagine,
how that interacts too much with language, like on the base level.
uh, but in general, things that we imagine are natural the way we think about them. It isn't natural to think of them that way. We just happen to. We live in a society that can measure some of these things and has come to define its understanding of these things based on these measurements. So
And without a perspective, it's really hard to envision otherwise.
yes.
Yeah.
So perhaps now the point number 5: learning the first language.
So the traditional view of learning the first language, Wittgenstein identified with Augustine, but it probably existed before him, and this is of ostensive definition. You know, mother and father are leading the child around and pointing at things and saying words, and the child is picking up those words. And you see this all the time. Parents leaning over the crib, being like, "Mama, Dada," you know. Uh, or if they have a dog too, puppy, all that. But Wittgenstein said that actually, the majority of language learned in the same way that the majority of language is these moves in a language game is through learning from other words to be able to compose statements. And this actually got into something that what we're talking about earlier, which is that there seems to be two methods learning of learning your first language.
Yes. Unfortunately, I was not able to remember the keyword for this. So if you are interested in this topic, I can't point you to any articles, but I wrote what I remembered. So there are even the descriptions of fragmentary versus grammatical are something that I pulled out of my memory. They might not be correct. Probably aren't because I wasn't able to find the article. Um, I have an example here, further to the right, of something that I heard my nephew say at the age of perhaps 2 years old. This was not in English, so these are all translations. He said, "Mother scares you," to his father. This is, of course, not the case. The mother did not scare um, her husband. It seems that the child wanted to say that he is scared, so he took a fragment, "scares you," which is probably something that his parents told him, that when they assumed he was scared, they asked, does, let's say, so, does the dog scare you? And he remembered this fragment, but could not really conjugate it correctly. And then the mother comes in the sense that he could not find his mother as she was in the shower at the moment. This would be a fragmentary use of language. So some children learn language like this. They start using words without having a correct grammar of their native language to use them with. In contrast, the lower line here, "Mother, give me milk, my sister came," are my own first words. I was actually, or my parents were told that I would be mute because I did not start babbling this kind of fragmentary language at the age of 1 or 2 or even 3. I think I was 3 years old when I started speaking, and I just went directly into using full sentences. And this is something that apparently the social workers of my region at that time were not aware of, but that I later found out is very common, that many children actually do skip straight to entire sentences. And in this case, they will babble nonsense sentences. So imagine the Scatman. the child is just making sounds for a long time, but not using the actual words, and then just like the flip of a switch, the entire sentences turn into entire sentences with real words. And
You could say you could say actually like brute forcing a language to connect to something that we've already come back on. He's trying to use the words or sounds in different positions until he gets something that approximates a sentence, and then he's like, "Oh yes, I found it."
yeah,
Yeah.
interestingly enough, of course, I actually ran into this because I was interested in how um, children learn minority languages. So I live abroad, so if I would to have children here, they would learn a minority language from me. And it turns out that these two ways of learning your first language do not correlate with anything interesting. Um, I would have expected, as I am quite good at learning languages, that the grammatical method would correlate with being able to learn languages easily, but that's not the case. Nothing interesting about this.
Yeah, and Wittgenstein illustrated this. Well, he illustrated the way that people learn language with a thought problem called Augustine's builders, and it uses the ostensive definition that Augustine did. Where these workers are trying to bring items up to maybe the base of a pyramid or some building they're constructing. So they're getting bricks and pillars and all this stuff, and you got the manager, and he's saying, and he's pointed at all this stuff and told them what it is, and now he's saying pillar, brick, etc. And just going off this, would the workers really know what to do? Because even in when we talked about fragmentary and grammatical, it still was meaningful fragments. The words inside the fragments were contextualized by other words. Mother scares you, uh, and so maybe if the guy had taught them, get the pillar, get the brick, they'd be able to fulfill the task. But then, even then, if distinctions have if meaningful distinctions haven't been made between the different things, how are they going to know which one to get, or the right way, or the right way to bring it? And so this comes back to when we're actually trying to tell people what to do, ordering people around in language, it's a lot more like get the pillar with four other guys because you're going to know that's the strength needed. It's all about defining stuff with in that basically get take the verb is defined by what it's getting, the pillars, and also additional instructions with four other people.
This is actually something that ties back into learning languages. Many of you might have heard about this kind of folk belief that you can only really learn a language by being immersed in that language and living in a country where that language is spoken. And as a result of this, quite many people believe that an immersion language course is somehow superior to actually being instructed in their native language. This is not the case. Immersion is not particularly effective. It is far from being the worst, but it is also far from being the best way to learn languages. What you need is understandable input. So you have to have correlations. What did I say? What did it mean? And if you just go in an immersion class and someone is babbling at you, of course you don't understand. They point at a tree, they say Baum. What does Baum mean? Does it mean tree as a concept? Is it this species of a tree? Is it the foliage? If the teacher was pointing at the foliage, maybe it means the kind of tree that has leaves or the kind that has nails. Maybe it means the trunk of the tree. Maybe it means living. Maybe it means summer. Maybe it means winter. Who knows? You really do need the verbal component to actually learn. And this is the case whether you are a small child or an adult.
And I think this nicely segues into our kind of digression on this about learning the second language, uh,
Yes.
which, well, I've been trying to learn a second language for about 4 years in high school, plus Spanish before that, but I've forgotten all of Spanish, so it doesn't really count. And you speak a bunch of languages, so
So um, there is a concept called linguistic aptitude that is an unexplained factor in how well people learn languages. As many of you are aware, people with richer families, more educated families, and so on, have a better time learning. Um, this could partly be genetic, of course, but even um, controlling for the effects of these kinds of social effects, like Wittgenstein had. He was, in his family, learning and intelligence was valued. It was not seen as a waste of time to study. In fact, he was most likely practically forced to do his best. And if he had not been, then certainly he would have not become such a world class intellectual, or he would have had a harder time doing it. But even controlling for all of these kinds of known variables, some people just learn languages easier than others. They need to use a smaller amount of work hours to achieve the same level of result. I have never been tested for this. The test would actually be just learning a conlang, a constructed language. So just testing, do you learn it easily or not? But I imagine that I have a high aptitude like this. And something that we came to compare is the way of separating languages mentally. I speak a number of languages, and a number of them are even of entirely different language families, and within the Indo-European family are different main branches. So, for example, um, closely related Germanic languages, such as English, Swedish, and German, all of which I speak, are very difficult for me to switch between on the fly. And if I try to do it, I usually have, I might phrase up. For example, in one case, I was at a conference in Berlin. I had given my presentation in English. I had been speaking with a Vietnamese colleague who we spoke English with. And then I went to chat with some German colleagues. And I just couldn't get a word of German out of my mouth. It took me like a minute to readjust to actually speak German. And sometimes I start mixing up the prepositions, for example. Tu and zu are the same preposition in English and High German. And sometimes when I try to switch between these languages, I use the wrong preposition between these. But I don't really have.
similarity seems to be the main variable in these. And what kind of spawned this thought was I was talking about learning French and English. And for me, it's still very hard for me. Whenever I try to speak French, it's like putting the words on top of an English script. It's not very efficient at all, and when it really comes down to it, like part of the reason I started streaming even was to see if I could get better at just doing French on the fly. But but yeah, there does seem to be a level of and my books were saying, oh, you should just start thinking in French, but it's like if I was to really actually try to start thinking in French, I might need a little bit of meditation or something like that to get all the English out of my head first.
Yeah. Um, I have never really tried to think in a language that I do not speak, you know, confidently. But I have found that in my case, my thinking language is very fluid. So I can, if I'm thinking about something that is naturally a dialogue, for example, I'm thinking about a topic that I've been talking about with someone in a specific language, I will mentally continue the dialogue in that language. Or, for example, when I am in language context, I will count in that language. So, for example, I was on holiday in Japan a couple of years ago, and when I went to the store, I counted the costs of the things I was buying from the combini in Japanese, and then when I was paying it, I had the amount in Japanese, and I counted it out in Japanese, and it just works. But this we unfortunately do not have any actual citations for how common this is, but it seems from my own experience, and I have one friend who has had the same experience, that it's much easier to switch between more distant languages. Per esempio, potrei cominciare a parlare italiano senza problemi. Ili могу говорить по-русски. But this kind of on-the-fly transformations between English and Swedish, for example, would be almost impossible for me. If this is a universal phenomenon, I don't know, but it's certainly an interesting one.
I did try to ask my grandpa about this since he's a neurologist, but he was not familiar with the subject.
Yeah,
So,
unfortunate. But dear viewers, if you are interested in this topic, perhaps you will be able to search something out yourself. Unfortunately, I don't have a keyword for this either. Often, whether you can find articles online is dependent on if you can remember or think of the right keyword. For example, the topic of fragmentary versus grammatical language. I think that even Wikipedia has an article on this, but you would have to either go digging through this kind of topic or just have a good guess on what it might be called. Or if you have access to a university library, they usually have professionals to help people with this kind of thing.
yeah, while we're kind of hitting a lull, I'd like to thank Caleb Horace TV for rating.
Oh, you can see it as well.
It's very much appreciated. If I don't know if it'll show in the chat, but I'm also hosting this at my channel, and I'm trying to break a affiliate. So it really helps if you also just mirror the stream in another tab there.
I was not up to date on the technical side of this. But thank you, Caleb, for me as well. I actually rated him earlier today. I rated him after my linguistic session, and now he has rated me after finishing his medieval adventure game, apparently. So thank you, Caleb, and perhaps we will move on to number 6.
Merci. All right.
Большое спасибо, molte grazie.
This gets more into on Wittgenstein's, big analysis on thought and how it's influenced by language. Wittgenstein came to doubt the concept of introspection and also the concept of intention as things that are real as we understand them in the mind. First, coming to introspection gives the false notion that a thought can be observed, and that means, in the same way that you look outside, you see something, you take it in with your senses. We have the same idea that there's a mind's eye in our head, and we can go back through our thoughts and see them in some kind of clarity. Maybe they degrade, but if you catch them, say if you catched it right after, it would probably be mostly together. Wittgenstein said no, because as soon as you think about a thought, you have overwritten it, and you have overwritten it unconsciously in ways that you don't even understand. And so he humorously argued, if you were for true introspection, you'd need a device that could look into someone's brain and also be able to split yourself in half. But this kind of plays into a larger narrative that language is this that when we're thinking in language about our own thoughts, intention, introspection, etc., uh, it's really language regulating and rationalizing things in our mind. And I think this is much more. You can see this much more in intention, where like if you actually stop and look at your intentions don't really line up with your actions. Like of course there's the example of not knowing your own strength. You do something, you put too much force into it, uh and you have a pretty good tactile sense, so that's a big folly mentally on your part, that didn't match up with your intention at all. But then you actually start to think about intention more, like what's the duration of your intention? It doesn't really have a genuine duration. Is it before? Is it after? Uh, After you think about it, how long were you intending before you actually took the action? Uh, and so, all these things considered, Wittgenstein basically just said that um, intention was a deception of language. In the same way that the feral child is acting instinctually, if you're acting on a different level than the thoughts that are rationalizing those actions, that are saying, uh, oh, I want to get this new car because it'll be a really nice addition to my garage, and you're thinking about buying that car for a bit, and then you buy it, and on some level there was a lot more going on than just that intention. And this is why actions don't really seem to line up with intentions very often. And from this, Wittgenstein said that a lot of people are known better by other people, by their actions, by what they put out into the world, than they know themselves, because we really have this awesome ability to rationalize whatever we're doing, uh, through language, through regulating and rationalizing our own thoughts.
And this is also an argument against describing yourself with um, you know self-administered personality tests, because you are giving your own opinion of how you are. These tests just help you vocalize what you think about yourself. So they are not really tests; they are just tools for you to describe what you think you are.
Yeah, the on those personality tests, one of the things that is very apparent if you see anyone taking them in real time is how much people will mull about over over the answers, when in reality they would do no such thing. Like would you, like, for example, they're given a prompt, would you buy this product, and it talks about the product and how it's advertised, and or maybe their friends are promoting it, and in reality, if they were in a store doing this, they just throw it down. It's nothing. It's a pack of candy or something like that. And they're standing at the personality test, like choosing the best answer that makes them seem the most sophisticated.
And then we get into a little bit of a digression again. We already had one case where we had to wonder if Wittgenstein was aware of something or did he intuit it. In that case, he most likely was aware of the state of science in his time. But in this case, he could not have been, because in the 2000s, there have been some studies that indicate that, at least in the simple case, this one was about the test subject deciding to press the button. So you get the chance, you sit there and you are told, press the button when you want to. So you have to make the decision to press the button, and then you press it. And with modern technology, you could actually look into the brain of the person doing the deciding. And it turns out that the gears start turning in their head 10 seconds before they consciously um, begin to think about what they are doing. So it seems that this process of decision is actually um, internal, subconscious, and the the rational reasons we give for our decision are actually a post hoc rationalization, exactly as Wittgenstein claimed. So it appears that he was able to intuit something that has been measured in more than 50 years after his own death.
Yeah. Um, and that kind of lines up with what I was saying about it coming from somewhere else, somewhere deeper in the mind, and then language is just telling the story. It's making a narrative for you. Um, and now moving on to sensation. Uh, sensation is much more surface and much more immediate, but Wittgenstein still said it was controlled and shaped by language. And the best way to put this is with advertising, because advertising has known this uh, actually around the time that Wittgenstein was thinking around this stuff, and began to associate products with feelings. I believe it was in the 50s actually or maybe the 40s, late 40s, early 50s, that there was that one of the first quote unquote modern ad campaigns involving women smoking as a meant to sell cigarettes as a it was being promoted as rebellious, as self-defining. And so with that, there came to that kind of got people thinking about associating emotions with products, and the one that is most prominent and easiest to see in advertising is the word love. Uh, when we when there's all these billboards which will tell you, uh, don't you just love this product, and it's being held up by a scantily clad half naked woman, and it's totally trying to get you to see, you love this product, tie it with other stimulus related to love, and basically change that sensation from something which might be, if we were to divide love into like its many base sensations, something erotic, or something romantic, and it's trying to tie that to an indulgence or pleasure from a product. Uh, and love actually has an interesting history as an emotion, because going back to older English, there's four loves: agape, storge, philia, and eros, and those are very distinct, and they've all kind of been lumped in under the banner of love. So you'll hear people say things like I worry about loving my friends too much, as if their purely platonic relationship with their friends is going to lead to them jumping the bed or something like that. Uh, all because language has tied these things together. And so Wittgenstein would go on to say that sensations under language are between something and nothing. They can be almost completely constructed out of nothing by language, but of course, we know that there are bases to these. There is some kind of base sadness, base anger, but even getting into things like hate or disgust, or the more complex feelings that arise from maybe these base sensations, we see that they're very much mixed together by whatever words you use.
And this is where we get into our final digression of the evening: fields of meaning. As Fleur here already alluded to, ancient Greek, from which these eros and agape and philia and so on are loaned from, has a much more granular breakdown of love than English does. So if I were to draw here, the English love contains the contents of the Greek words, but they are not the same, but they are all love. These are the field of meaning of love contains all of the other four. My own example was between English and German. In German, you have a lot of things that are described as Lager. Usually, this is translated as camp. So, for example, you have a holiday camp, Urlaubslager. But generally, only the lagers that contain people are called camps in English. The kinds of lagers that contain items are called stores, storerooms in English. For example, if you buy something online in Germany, you might see a note that has a green dot and says auf Lager, so on camp. Means in store, so they can send it to you right away. And these kinds of differences in the fields of meaning also exist for emotions, as alluded to before. And I have another example in the opposite direction. These are things that are differentiated in English, but that are lumped together in the Finnish language. So, viha can mean things that in English we would call hate or anger, but also righteous indignation. So, if you see someone committing a misdeed, doing a crime, doing something wrong, the feeling of distaste that you get from that, you probably would not describe that as hatred, but it comes under the same umbrella term in the Finnish language. Um,
Yeah.
to what extent this influences the actual behavior and the functions of emotions and sensations, I don't know. I don't know if anyone knows, but they are certainly very differently conceptualized.
Yeah, I mean, even thinking about English, I brought up the example of hate as is hate disgust or is hate anger at something, because uh, and even then you'll see a lot of people become and there is maybe some tie because you see people becoming angry at being exposed to things that they're disgusted of sometimes, but not always. And so it's interesting that we use hate as both like virulent anger and also as just you could hate a food, but it's not like you would get particularly angry if you saw that food.
Exactly. So if I let's imagine chicken knees is something that Chinese people do actually eat. I had a friend who cooked for me once, and unfortunately, I was not able to eat the chicken knees. I might feel disgust at the idea of eating cartilage, but anger, no, I don't get angry when I see chicken knees, and I don't become fearful either. Fear is another one that has a sort of overlap with hate. So when we say that we hate things, uh, we have a sort of overlap with with fear. If I hate dogs, for example, it might be that you fear dogs. Um, if you hate injustice, then you get angry when you see injustice. If you hate cockroaches, what did I write? Distung. I don't know what this was supposed to
Right,
be.
it was you might fear cockroaches or
Yeah,
get scared.
disgust. Disgust is what I was trying to write here. So if you hate cockroaches and you see a cockroach, you would feel disgust, but not necessarily anger or fear.
Yeah, and that covers my knowledge of Wittgenstein. So I left in a little area at the bottom where we could kind of freely talk about our thoughts about this. I'd like to say, because I forgot to mention earlier, but it kind of is a nice wrap up to all this, that Wittgenstein compared language to a fly bottom, in that you enter because there's honey at the bottom. Language definitely has done a lot to improve humanity and allow us to communicate in more complex ways uh, and strengthen our bonds. But at the same time, it is also, depending on which language you might have, you may be limited in the terms of thinking you can have. But also at the same time with that, it's not like this is something permanent that you're just stuck in. And this is something we had a free discussion on with my teacher, but all the people who were naturally bilingual, had parents speaking in both languages all the time, Wittgenstein came very, very easy to them because they already had two distinct languages with differences that made them think when switching between them in their mind, it's very weird how these two languages conceptualize things differently. And so, sure, we may have a fly bottle, but by picking up other languages, by picking up how a language has been spoken throughout its history differently, you can kind of get a bigger picture, and that fly bottle can expand. So, you're never going to be able to go back to pure thoughts and pure instinct. And I don't know if you want to, despite the popularity of Return to Monkey and that kind of a trend. But it's but in terms of being able to conceptualize more, to not be limited by whatever presuppositions your language comes with, the best way is just to start acquiring another language, and that doesn't even mean speaking it. For me, like I think I've learned a lot about English just from writing French a bunch. And I know that California, the reason why they teach 2 years of LOT, which most people will not come out of that fluent, is with 2 years of LOT, you get to you get a language other than English. That's what that stands for. You get a better conception of whatever language you started in. Like, for example, my language teacher one day just sat down to talk about how, because we were learning adjectives in French, how English has this unspoken has this unspoken order of adjectives. Like, it's odd to say brown big dog, but it's fine to say big brown dog. And through learning another language, when you would come to that part in another language, it would make you think, wait, so there's an order to adjectives in this language. There's an order to adjectives in the English language, and that might help them to become a better writer, or even intentionally subvert that if it would be good for their writing.
Pardon me, I was concentrating on on banning this bot for a moment.
I see them everywhere. Yeah,
Yeah,
they're very persistent.
yeah, we'd have to get some kind of filter for them or something. What I was thinking about during your turn was that actually for learning foreign languages, learning two related languages has a better effect than learning the same amount of time in one language. This was a study done in Japan, actually. And in one case, they used 3 class years to teach students French. And in the other case, they used 2 class years in French and 1 class year in Latin. So the same amount of work went towards learning both French and Latin as did to learn only French. And the result was that this group came out speaking French better than the ones who spent 3 years learning only French. So this kind of supporting languages supporting each other is not only not only something that we might have noticed in our everyday lives. It is also something that can be very distinctly measured. And then the other one was about the kinds of different thinking in different languages. Because it is quite true that some languages make different distinctions, particularly in their grammar, that I find extremely interesting. For example, the Romance languages have mirrored grammar, so they have the same amount of tenses, so time forms, for facts, and then for rumors or conjecture or things that are not necessarily true. And of course, the result is that it is very easy to be very nuanced when talking in French or Italian or Latin in a way that you have to make an effort to do if you are speaking in English or German, which both have very weak conjunctives. And on the other side, the Baltic Finnic languages, which contain Finnish, for example, have a very robust system for repetition. So you can very easily conjugate verbs for if you are doing something, say, only once, or an undistinct amount, or a lot of times. This is even used to formulate, so communicate different things. So you might, for example, if you walk repeatedly, that's going on a walk. And if you kick at a ball repeatedly, then you are not, playing football. You are playing at football. So having fun while kicking the ball. That's kind of distinctions have to be made in a different way in different languages, and the way that they have to be made might be more difficult. So you might not make the effort of making the distinction in everyday language.
Yeah, I think an example you brought up was also that's interesting was an Iberian language that did not distinguish between future and present, so people saved a lot more money.
Yeah, that's an example that gets a little bit into pseudoscience. So I have read publications making this kind of claims, but the problem is that there are languages which have a periphrastic future. For example, English, German, Finnish, a lot of North European languages. Um, so, for example, in German and Finnish, you might say it rains tomorrow, so it will rain tomorrow. And only if you absolutely have to explicate that it will rain tomorrow, you will use a different formulation for it. Whereas Southern European languages have a more strongly grammatical future. So you might say in Italian, pioverà, uh, piove for today, pioverà for tomorrow. So it is instantly differentiated. Some individuals um, have tried to interpret this in the way that it would be this linguistic difference causing Northern Europe to be wealthier than Southern Europe. But unfortunately, I don't think I can link to the World Atlas of Language Structures, at least not quickly. But it is you can find a data point in the walls for this which future there is. And it turns out that there are languages with both variants all around the world. So looking at this globally, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to make this kind of claims. It might have a small effect. For example, everything else being equal, it might be that the periphrastic future would then lead to slightly more future-oriented work, but it's certainly not the major deciding factor.
Hmm.
Actually, if you have something to talk about, please do. I will actually look up the World Atlas of grammatical of language, the World Atlas of language structures, and try to get us a screenshot of the map here on the whiteboard.
Ah, that's wonderful. Yeah, so take what I brought up with a grain of salt. But the other thing I wanted to brought up is is with a mountain of salt, but it's still a fun thing to talk about, and that's because it's Easter. There does seem to be a kind of a not universal language of symbols, but universal language of general story patterns that humanity falls into. And because you all have watched Star Wars, I assume that many of you are familiar with the hero with 1,000 faces, which is a general story structure about someone uh, entering a different world from their own, basically being removed from their comfortable life circumstances, learning, facing personal threats, and returning to their normal world, to their comfortable life with some new knowledge that will help them on the way. And this is mirrored even in things like Bildungsroman and other structures like that. And of course, this comes from Joseph Campbell, but it's very much steeped in the theories of Carl Jung and archetypes, which he attributed to basically why so many cultures have similar religious and cultural symbols uh, that speak to greater truths underlying human nature, which he called a collective unconscious. And in terms of research into the collective unconscious, they've found that when one animal, now studying with animal populations, when one animal acquires something, or when one animal population acquires something, it seems that that is synchronized in some ways with other populations doing the same thing within the same animal species. But that of course is a hotly debated topic. But ultimately, that just speaks to, even as you learn different languages and different consumptions, uh, as much as Wittgenstein's tried to paint all of philosophy, all of metaphysical philosophy as um, is people playing around with language. Like, what is the ship of Theseus, except a move in a language game of, this ship belongs to Theseus, it hasn't been destroyed, so we don't need to think about uh, think about it. And sure, it may have been gradually replaced until there's nothing left of the original, but for all intents and purposes, it's still the ship of Theseus, and it only interests us because it plays with a little logic bug in our language and contemporary. But in terms of actual metaphysical concepts like that are that relate more to the mentality of humanity, like mother and father, or and that is attributing that to gods, sky father, earth mother. These things are recurrent patterns throughout humanity, separated by language, geography, ethnicity, culture, everything, but we still see them keep popping up. And so even with all I've learned about Wittgenstein, I still think that there are great metaphysical truths to the universe. It's not just all us playing around with language, but I do think you have to see more of that. You have to study beyond your little bubble. You have to learn about other cultures. You have to learn about history. If you're just stuck in your own little conception, you'll probably do something cringy in New Age.
I agree entirely. I myself have a fairly wide education. As I mentioned, I used to be a physics student, but then changed into something fun. I also have a keen interest in various um, historical topics, not only the language, but in history, archaeology, some genetics comes into question as well. And I agree entirely, and I suggest to everyone who has an interest in really anything to study things that are tangential to your own interest. So do not just burrow into a detail of your own greatest interest, but keep an eye out for things that it connects to. This is, of course, exactly the way that academia works. If you want to write a doctoral thesis, you have to find some tiny, minuscule point that you have to work on and cannot be a generalist in that role. But even if you are in that position, looking outside will help you understand what is a question that can be answered by further work, and it will help you answer that question as well. So, we are most likely coming to an end. I have found the data point, I think 49. No, feature 67A, the future. So here the red points are inflectional futures, so Fachero, and the white points are periphrastic futures, so I will do. And as you can see, you can find either of these anywhere in the world. So not really something that you can.
Sorry about the dog barking.
I think I don't think that's going to be a big disturbance. We are coming to an end in any way.
Yeah, we're coming to an end.
You can see the map. I have posted a link to the Word Atlas of Language Structures. This might be interesting to non-experts as well. Um, if even to look up your own native language, check out some of the data points, see how common these are around the world. And there are some defining articles for some of the data points. They might be written for academics. I haven't read one immediately before now, so I understood them when I read them, but I might have a lot more, basis information than you do. But I recommend taking a look. I think these datasets can be interesting even if you are not able to use them for research or anything like that.
Yeah, with that, I think we've said all that we have on our minds, and thank you everyone for coming. I love to talk about these things, and I'd like to do more philosophy in the future. So, if you're interested in that thing, follow me, and you'll be able to see this from time to time, preferably with other people who are scholarly and academic, like Mr. Wood here. It's been very fun talking to you.
Thank you, likewise.
Yeah.
And
As for
if any of your listeners are not familiar with me, please follow me if you want to have information about linguistics. My plan is currently to have a linguistics topic on Sundays. Today it was about general topics, reduction of vowel reduction and the behavior of syllables in general. Last week it was about the history of the French language, and next week it will be about the history of the German language. And we have a long comment. Let's read it out.
yeah.
Robert Brown says, there is the meme, English is not a language, it's three languages wearing a French coat pretending to be one. I think French, German and Latin are mentioned with that quote. It feels like knowing a few bits of basic French already helps with some pronunciation issues in English. This is entirely correct. The part about speaking French helping with English pronunciation is 100% correct. For those in the audience who did not watch my previous episodes on topics touching this, there are basically two major reasons why English spelling is as horrible as it is. One of them is that there has not been a spelling reform in over 500 years. So a lot of the silent letters used to be pronounced. If you go to read Geoffrey Chaucer, for example, who wrote in the 1300s, if you read it out and pronounce every single letter, then you come out with more or less a correct pronunciation. So, have, for example, I have, was still pronounced the ich habe in Chaucer's time. And the other reason is the massive amount of French, Latin, Greek loanwords taken from the Mediterranean prestige languages, where the pronunciation has not been changed intentionally, but it has changed, so it's not the same as in the original language. The spelling is the same as in the original language, and in some cases, the plurals are the same as in the original language. So, for example, you have one formula, but you might say you have several formulae, or you might just have use your head and say you have several formulas. Because if you use the English plural, it's always correct. But if you try to use the original plural and you mess it up, you end up looking dumb to exactly the kind of people you are trying to impress. A classical example for this is octopus. Octopus sounds like it could be a Latin word, but it's not. It's Greek. So you have a single octopus, And the best thing to say is that you have several octopuses. What is absolutely wrong is to say you have several octopi. That's just wrong. If you want to be pretentious, you should say you have several octopodes. Of course, nobody knows that except the people who you are trying to impress. So my advice is always use the English plural. You can't mess it up. As to three languages wearing a trench coat, this is actually something that I will get to in the future. English is a contact language, and for the viewers who watched the episode on the history of French, I got slightly into the contact language problematic. Romance, so the language that modern Italian and French and Spanish and Romanian have developed from, seems to have emerged as a merging together of the different Italic languages, so Latin, Faliscan, Oscan, Umbrian, that kind of thing. And a similar process happened with English between the North Sea Germanic, so the Anglo-Saxons, and North Germanic, so the Vikings, in the Middle Ages. I have not yet gone into entire episodes on grammar history. I eventually will. I've been thinking that I'll talk about, phonological history, sound changes before that, because it seems like it would be easier to approach. I think probably once you've listened to a bunch of language history for a couple of months, you won't have you won't be afraid to listen to something about grammar. But if it's your first episode, you might think, no, I don't understand that. I don't want to listen. But if this topic interests you, sometime in the future, perhaps even months in the future, I will tackle this in an actual episode.
And that about wraps up the time I have, because there's a basket of candy outside my door, and I promised Ida wrap this up by about now. So I'm just going to post my Twitter where I post my schedules, and well, I'll see you. Au revoir.
Au revoir.